conspiracy theories. And what I'm going to talk about is really 5 key elements of conspiracy theories, and sort of break it down in that way. So hopefully it'll be fairly easy to follow, because studying conspiracy theories itself can be a bit of a going down a rabbit hole. So I've tried to sort of break down what I think are the most important elements of the relationship between conspiracy theories and right-wing extremism. Really, what I've gathered in my research, so through my doctorate and other research into the far right historically, and fascism and neo-Nazis, whatever you want to call related groups, is that conspiracy theories are really an essential part of far right ideology. You can't really, there is no far right, fascist, Nazi party or individual to my mind that I've ever come across that doesn't subscribe in some way to a conspiracy theory, or I would even say conspiracy theories are always an essential part. And what they do really is they provide a framework for very, very extreme thinking, and I'll get on to what I mean by that a bit later. Really, all I mean by a conspiracy theory is the idea that a plot or a conspiracy is behind an event or a process. So it can be a specific event, or it can be a process of government or whatever. But I think we all know what a conspiracy theory is. But yeah, I think the idea of there being a plot is the most important. I think one thing I would also say just before is that it's wrong to think of conspiracy theories as kind of superstition or paranoia. I think these sorts of psychological, I mean, there are obviously psychological components to why people subscribe to conspiracy theories, but I think historically they've been sort of dismissed as things that sort of crazy people believe. And I just don't think that's I think that's a very, very simplistic and dismissive way of looking at conspiracy theories. And just, I think it's more convincing to think of them as far more mainstream and widespread than we might think. What conspiracy theories are, they're not psychological delusions in and of themselves. What they are is that they're ideas that are supported by very, very weak or distorted or fabricated evidence. So don't think of conspiracy theories as anything necessarily different to ordinary ideas. Just think of them as ideas that, yeah, I do not follow what we would consider truthful or reliable or supported by evidence. They are also political tools as well as ideas. So whilst we can get quite caught up in the details of conspiracy theories and the sort of particular nature of them, they are ultimately political and communication devices. And again, I'll get on to what I mean about that a bit later. They're not just ideas detached from any kind of political purpose. They are in and of themselves a political purpose. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about disinformation and misinformation. The distinction between those being disinformation is willfully created false information that is then distributed, and misinformation is just wrong information that is distributed. So disinformation implies a sort of intent to spread false information, whereas misinformation is somebody perhaps unwittingly spreading conspiracy theories or whatever without actually knowing that it's false. And I suppose the distinction with what I would say with conspiracy theories, do we know if it's disinformation or misinformation? Do we know if people know that what they're saying is a load of rubbish and they're just spreading it anyway to cause trouble or to gain political advancement? Or are they just very, very misguided people? I sort of answer this question by saying we don't know. We can't look inside the heads of people who spread conspiracy theories or how they've come to those ideas. I'm comfortable with not knowing whether they actually believe what they are talking about, or whether they are doing it, as I say, to spread false information. So the first thing I would say, the first fact about conspiracy theories is that they are red pills. And red pilling is a phrase that is used increasingly amongst the far right, particularly in online communities. And what I mean by that is it's a reference used by the far right to the film The Matrix. Um, and in the film, the character there, you can see the reflection of him in the glasses, Neo. He discovers the Matrix, this kind of parallel universe or alternate universe where you can see how everything that he has been living, what he thought was reality, is actually just a mirage, and it's a reality that is being given to him by somebody else, by the real men in power. So you can obviously see the relationship that has with conspiracy theories. And at the beginning, fairly close to the beginning of the film, he is offered by someone to take a red pill. And if he takes the red, or rather to take a red pill or a blue pill, and if he takes a red pill, then his eyes are opened to how the world really works. He suddenly understands the real sort of source of power in the world, how everything operates. But he's also given the opportunity to take a blue pill, and if he takes a blue pill, he will go back to his sort of ordinary life of ignorance. He'll forget everything that he's been told. He will go back to believing the world, the reality that he saw originally. And I think this is, whilst the far right use this, somebody is red-pilled, they are believers of conspiracy theories. They understand how the world works according to the far right, according to far right ideology. So someone who is red-pilled believes in Zionist occupation government. They believe in demographic conspiracies, and I'll get into what these are later. They believe in cultural Marxism, another conspiracy theory. So it's a way the far right used to frame people who really understand how the world works. And so people who are red-pilled are people who kind of believe in a conspiratorial view of the world, which is often anti-Semitic. It often demonizes ethnic minorities, sources of power in the world. On the other hand, people who are blue-pilled, and I think probably the vast majority of people in this audience are blue-pilled, one would hope, are people who believe in boring things and false things like mainstream education. They might still they don't believe everything they were taught at school was a load of rubbish. They might believe what they see on TV. They might think that Netflix is a kind of benign just thing providing entertainment. They might believe what they read in newspapers. They might watch BBC News and think it's not false. They also believe in political correctness, i.e., and when the far right talk about political correctness, they often mean not being racist. So I think that's a good distinction of why with the far right, it's sort of conspiracy theories provide them with you're sort of with us, you're red-pilled, or you're blue-pilled and you're against us. So it provides a very, very easy narrative. Another sort of thing I want to say about conspiracy theories, I think anti-Semitism really is crucial to understanding how conspiracy theories have developed historically. And whilst modern conspiracy theories do demonize all sorts of groups, not just Jewish people, but Muslims, black people, all sorts of groups, anti-Semitism really is the root of conspiracy theories. And I think this is because anti-Semitism, which is perhaps Europe's oldest form of racism, which goes back centuries, has always been based on very, very conspiratorial stereotypes of Jews. And anti-Semitism really has been, unfortunately, part of European culture, the cultural fabric for hundreds of years. And a lot of these conspiratorial ideas of ethnic minorities come from these stereotypes of Jewish people. So things like being greedy, being out for themselves, being disloyal, all of these complete false stereotypes. These are the foundation of a lot of conspiracy theories. And also the belief of Jewish people holding some kind of special power and control over the world. It's obviously conspiracy theory, but it has gained a large amount of currency, particularly in the early 20th and late 19th century. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion is kind of one of the foundational texts of modern conspiracy theories. So this text was a forgery created in the former Russian Empire, and it was published in English in 1919, and therefore became much more widespread in the sort of English-speaking world. But it was translated into other languages as well. And yeah, and this text really is quite important, I think. What the text is it's a fabricated, as I say, completely fabricated minutes of a meeting which never happened. And in this minutes of the meeting, it creates a blueprint for what would be a Jewish takeover of the world. So it's a meeting attended by prominent Jewish elders, very powerful people, and they sort of say all sorts of things about what they will do to try and take over the world. So things like take control of the banking system, or start lots of wars, because then it will destroy other countries and then we can take over. So it's all these measures that would be undertaken in order to take over the world. And despite it being a known forgery, pretty soon after it came out, it was created by the Russian Secret Service at the time as a way of, stigmatizing the Jewish communities in Russia, or the former Russian Empire. It became very, very influential, and a lot of the ideas of fascism and the far right of the interwar period, which obviously brought about Nazi Germany and all the regimes that took over during the Second World War, a lot of these ideas of Jewish people sort of took root in those circles. And I think most conspiratorial anti-Semitism, even like what you get today, is derivative of the protocols in some way. And the protocols is derivative of anti-Semitism that came before it. So you might hear terms that sort of Donald Trump and supporters use, like globalist, quite big amongst the alt-right. I mean, that they mean by that a globalist has anti-Semitic undertones of this kind of world conspiracy theory that Jewish people are trying to take over. Even anti-Semitism that you might get on the left of politics sometimes, or amongst Islamist extremists, when they refer to Zionists, they are often referring to not to the state of Israel as we know it. They're referring to a Zionist, i.e. Jewish conspiracy. And even conspiracy theories that pick on individuals like George Soros, who is Jewish, a sort of very wealthy Jewish man who people use that to demonstrate that all Jewish people are like that, or like George Soros. Even then, they are anti-Semitic because they are picking out the characteristics of him that fit into that sort of stereotypical image of Jewish people trying to seek power, trying to use their money for bad ends, trying to weaken society in some way. And moving kind of, I've sort of skipped the Second World War and all that because I think it's sort of quite obvious what happened there. But the Holocaust is obviously a seminal event in European history and a seminal event in the history of the far right, because it destroyed the reputation of the far right. And they did not become anti-Semitic because of the Holocaust. Sorry, they did not stop being anti-Semitic after the Holocaust. They instead thought of how they could continue anti-Semitism when the whole world was outraged by the treatment and murder of millions of Jewish people. So what they did was they created a new conspiracy theory which built on previous Jewish stereotypes. And this is Holocaust denial. And they refer to it as historical revisionism. It's not historical revisionism. It's not a different take on a historical event. There is no legitimacy in any scholarship for Holocaust denial. And it sort of speaks to what Charlie was saying about often there is a kernel of truth, and you read historical books about the Holocaust, with Holocaust denial books, and they take legitimate statistics and they twist them, or they take witness testimony and they twist them and they say, well, this can't have happened. And then they create this narrative that therefore the whole of the Holocaust is grossly exaggerated, or you can't trust the statistics, or it's just entirely, some people just argue it's entirely false and just literally never happened. And it disputes various things like the number of Jewish people killed. It argues them in gas chambers. It sort of creates these pseudo-scientific studies of concentration camps saying there's no trace of any of these the chemicals that would have been used, and there would be, even though these are just discredited by science. They minimize Hitler's involvement. So David Irving in particular, he's sort of more interested in absolving Hitler and the Nazis of any responsibility. He's sort of more, which obviously opens the door to revisionism of Hitler himself rather than the Holocaust. So there's an underlying goal there, which is to change the narrative of the Second World War as well as the Holocaust, to try and revive the reputation of fascism and Nazism. And again, they argue that why would people make up the Holocaust? Well, again, it feeds into typical anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jewish people seeking power, and they argue that it was designed to generate sympathy for Jews during the foundation of the state of Israel, and as well as it being a financial racket. So the reparations payments paid by Germany and other European countries to Israel as sort of compensation for the Holocaust and sort of the wealth, destruction of Jewish property and wealth. They argue that that's really just a financial racket. So again, it's kind of feeding into these stereotypes of Jewish people as sort of conning people or being financially slippery and things like that. So there's Holocaust denial is a modern take on an old conspiracy theory. And cultural Marxism is another anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and this is a much more modern and actually much more mainstream one. There have been some very high-profile politicians in Britain, France, Germany who have made reference to cultural Marxism. And this is the conspiracy theory behind so-called anti-political correctness narratives. I think everyone here will be familiar with far-right narratives of being against political correctness. This is the conspiratorial underpinning of this very, very common far-right view. And this is based on an idea that a group of Marxist academics, part of the Frankfurt School, which was a very influential it was a very influential school of thought in the 1930s and beyond. It argues that these academics, essentially, their ideas took over US universities in the 1960s, and they had an intent to push anti-Western ideas on students. So things to do with critical race theory, so understanding racism, things like gay rights, LGBT rights, feminism, anti-war ideas, so anti-Vietnam War, pacifism, communism, all these things. These were all ideas that were pushed on students in the 1960s by these very, very powerful Marxist academics. I mean, they were very, very sort of successful academics, but I don't think they had quite that much power. So we're talking there about people like Horkheimer, Adorno, and Lukács, and a number of very, very, very famous academics. Cultural Marxism, they therefore argue, is to blame for modern political correctness, because you have all these people who were educated in the 1960s and 70s who are now in charge of big institutions like the BBC and government. And now you see things like gender fluidity, atheism, all of this being pushed on people from these elite institutions. So it's sort of a different take on power. It doesn't look at power of government as such, but cultural power. And it basically argues that because of these sort of very, very powerful and influential academics, that's why we now have political correctness. I mean, I think there are kernels of truth in that people who manage institutions like the BBC or government have had a different type of education to those who maybe would have done 50 years ago, 100 years ago. But again, it takes something or it takes like the left-wing background of someone and turns it into this sort of grand conspiracy theory about these sort of very, very powerful academics. And it is often anti-Semitic. I think often people use the term cultural Marxism without intending or associating it to be anti-Semitic, but for the far right, it is always linked to Jewish academics. And key Jewish thinkers. So they talk about Sigmund Freud, George Lukács, Eric Hobsbawm, anyone basically who's Jewish and an academic who's influential, they argue is powerful, is part of a cultural Marxist plot. And yeah, so you see many of the same stereotypes even with that you do with Holocaust denial with cultural Marxism, which is a much more mainstream conspiracy theory. So I think the anti-Semitism element is really important. I also think it's important to understand that conspiracy theories, they are extreme manifestations of mainstream concerns. So it sort of speaks to that idea of there being kernels of truth. I think I would put it a different way in that mainstream concerns that ordinary people have are often taken to extreme ends by others. So demographic conspiracy theories are probably the most popular on the far right now. And this is a term I use for a kind of bucket of conspiracy theories that all basically argue the same thing. So the modern far right, vast majority believe in some way that immigration and multiculturalism, these are purposefully directed from the top and designed specifically to destroy Western culture and or the white race. So it's the argument that immigration of people from Middle East, North Africa, and Africa more broadly, or in the UK case, the Caribbean, that happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s. This is an attempt by very, very shady and powerful elites to weaken the bonds of white European Christian civilization, to try and polarize people and to ultimately destroy Western culture and create either an Islamized culture or a globalist culture that has no national component. The biggest targets of these conspiracy theories are Muslims, and I think this is because the far right in the modern day is predominantly anti-Muslim rather than necessarily anti-Jewish. I'm talking about the mainstream, not the mainstream far right, there's no such thing really, but sort of the populist far right, the sort of Marine Le Pen's, the sort of Alternative for Germany. These groups, they are mostly anti-Muslim, and the reason why the Muslims are targets of this is because obviously the most visible ethnic minorities often in Western European countries are Muslims. They are often targeted, and the far right use their presence as a way to say, well, they are here as they are not here because they want to be here. They have been purposefully placed here by elites to try and destroy the rest of us. And this conspiracy theory is often called the Great Replacement. So this is a book by a very sort of, I think he's a Front National or whatever they're called now, Rassemblement National politician, who wrote this book. It's not the famous Camus. His name is Renaud Camus. So it's often called the Great Replacement, or it's called white genocide. You may have heard that term. That tends to be used by sort of neo-Nazis and the very, very extreme end. They say it's not about European culture, it's about the white race, and it's about non-whites trying to replace and infect the sort of gene pool of the white race. So you get different variations. There is also an anti-Semitic interpretation of this, obviously, because as I've already mentioned, anti-Semitism is never far away with the far right. And this is often called the Kalergi plan. So Kalergi was, to be honest, I can't even remember off the top of my head who Kalergi was, but I think he was an influential person in Hungary, I believe, and basically very, very wealthy Jewish people are behind the Great Replacement or are behind this process of white genocide. So this conspiracy theory doesn't always say it's Jewish people behind it, but when it's used by neo-Nazis or very, very extreme people, they often say it's Jewish people behind this polluting of the white race or this polluting of Western culture. And it's very popular amongst what we call the identitarian movement in Europe and North America. So I won't go into them because that's a sort of different subject on its own, but the identitarian movement is particularly attractive to young people. And they are quite fringe within the far right, but they are quite extreme. And I think they are gaining traction amongst young people. And even right-wing extremist terrorists like Brenton Tarrant in Christchurch, who obviously murdered dozens of Muslims worshipping in 2 mosques. He demonstrated, he subscribes to these conspiracy theories. He called his manifesto the Great Replacement. He believed that the Muslims he was attacking were kind of part of this plan to destroy Western culture. He saw them as enemy combatants because he believed that they were part of a sort of scheme to get rid of European and white culture. So these ideas, as absurd as they sound, they are never benign. They are never harmless, really. And then you come to QAnon. This is obviously a sort of probably the most bonkers conspiracy theory that I've come across, but it does seem to be gaining traction, particularly in America and more so in Britain, following Donald Trump's kind of the publicity around Donald Trump not really endorsing it, but not really distancing himself from it either. QAnon is conspiracy theory that Satan worshipping paedophiles control the world. Yeah. It alleges that elites like Hillary Clinton are part of a global sex trafficking ring, and those elites were the ones who were trying to seeking the downfall of Donald Trump, who is the one person who knows about QAnon. He's trying to stop it. I mean, he didn't actually endorse it, but so it's a bit odd for someone who's sort of the great bulwark against this thing that he never really mentioned it. And there's been quite a lot of surge in QAnon. This is a largely online movement, but actually a lot of the people that stormed Congress were related to QAnon. I think actually one of the people that was killed was a sort of QAnon subscriber. So this is, I'm not going to go into too much detail about QAnon, but this is another conspiracy theory that is quite popular amongst the far right. I mentioned before about these conspiracy theories being extreme manifestations of mainstream concerns. What I mean with those two is the public at large has become more skeptical of immigration more broadly. Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred has risen over the last 10, 20 years. And so these conspiracy theories, they are very, very extreme manifestations of these concerns that are held by large numbers of the population. I mean, a lot of people who vote for right-wing populist parties for the reason that they are concerned about multiculturalism or too many Muslims in their country, they might say, or they might be concerned by immigration. They might not necessarily believe in these conspiracy theories, but as I say, these conspiracy theories, they really sort of take what are believed by large numbers of people and turn them into very, very extreme things. And with QAnon, you might think, well, what on earth has that got to do? What can possibly be mainstream about that? But I think it does speak to a more general mistrust of elites that has been happening over the last 10, 15 years. I think you look at the election of people like Trump, the surge in popularity of people like Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage, pretty much every European country has got examples of this. I think there is a more general mistrust in traditional, more liberal centrist elites. And whilst most people would think QAnon is completely mad, I think it kind of does indicate that the sort of decline in support for people who traditionally were given a lot of trust. Most people who don't like politicians do not believe that the elite are Satan worshipping paedophiles, but I think it does speak to a more widespread mistrust. So conspiracy theories, I would argue, are a multi-purpose political tool. And what I mean by this is that they serve a number of functions. The far right use conspiracy theories for a number of reasons. They use them to delegitimize perceived enemies. So these are a number of people. The far right has a lot of enemies. They try and delegitimize governments by saying, well, they're not really in control. They're being told what to do by their paymasters, whether they're Jewish people or the sort of political correctness lobby or whatever. They use it, and I suppose it delegitimizes their power, because they're saying they're not really the ones in charge. They try and delegitimize perceived enemies like ethnic minorities, obviously Muslims or people from North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, anyone who's not white really. They are seen as tools of conspiracy theories. They are not here because they decided to emigrate for a legitimate reason, they would argue. They're not here to work and provide for their families. They're not here to create a new life for themselves. They are here because they are puppets of a global conspiracy. So this helps stigmatize ethnic minorities. And as I mentioned, in the extreme cases, people see ethnic minorities as kind of enemy combatants, like Brenton Tarrant, which can actually lead to sort of violence against them. The media is a classic one. The media, the idea of like a kind of Jewish-controlled media, it goes really far back in far-right circles. But even today, the idea that the media is kind of controlled by very, very wealthy elite, a shady elite, a politically correct elite who have nothing in common with the average person. Again, all of these institutions, the far right are trying to delegitimize by saying they are part of a conspiracy theory. Sorry, they are part of a conspiracy. Conspiracy theories as well, and I think this is really important, they provide justification for very, very extreme solutions. So this is sort of looking historically, but you can also see shades of this presently. I mean, if we take Nazi Germany, the idea of a Jewish conspiracy theory was really essential to how the Nazis saw the Jewish community in Germany and then later occupied Europe. So this was the basis for harsh laws, like the Nuremberg laws, which forbid Jewish people from marrying German people. Because if you believe that an ethnic minority is evil or out for no good or trying to kind of weaken the country, then it gives a justification in the eyes of the far right, or a rationale for restricting them. It gives a justification for excluding them from society because they are not legitimate actors in society. And this is why the far right argue that harsher laws should be issued against Muslims, which ban worship, ban mosques, or ban halal slaughter, or ban and basically weaken the autonomy of Muslims, their right to their human rights to worship and their human rights to follow their faith and their culture. They argue the fact that they believe they are part of a conspiracy theory provides justification for that. And in the most extreme case, it provides the justification for genocide. Pretty much all genocides I've studied and come across, and I lectured a sort of course on a global history of genocide, which looks at genocides in all parts of the world, not just Europe. Pretty much all genocides are founded on the belief that another group is all powerful and therefore must be destroyed. I mean, the genocide of European Jews during the Holocaust was based on the extreme belief that if they weren't destroyed, they would destroy the Aryan race, or were in the process. So genocide is the most extreme manifestation. I should also add to that terrorism in the case of Brenton Tarrant. If you genuinely believe that Muslims worshipping in a mosque are enemy combatants who could at any moment rise up and try and take over the country, then that could lead people to very, very extreme solutions. Conspiracy theories, they also radicalize and recruit others. So I think Charlie alluded to this at the beginning, where he said kind of makes people feel part of an in-group. If you feel like you're party to some special knowledge, then this is a really empowering thing for some people, and it can radicalize them. It can make them believe that they have a sort of special mission, they have special knowledge, and therefore they must do something about it. And that could be to join a far-right party, it could be to become a far-right activist, or it could be to become a far-right terrorist. And it also helps recruit others. Obviously, the far right use conspiracy theories as a sort of way in. They sort of tell people, oh, did you know that actually those immigrants in your town, they're not actually there because of the reason you've been told. They're actually there because of the Great Replacement. This brings people in. It gives people a sort of simplistic explanation. And then once they're in, that's when the radicalization can start. And just finally, I won't go into too much detail, and this is sort of to end on a slightly worrying note. Conspiracy theories are more widely believed than you might think. So this is a study by clinical psychologists at Oxford University to do with coronavirus. And you can see here that the majority of people do not agree. Nobody would say that a majority of people believe in conspiracy theories, but a worryingly large number of people believe in some quite outlandish conspiracy theories. If you look at agree moderately and agree a lot and agree completely, so they agree to some degree, I mean, even agree a little. Jews have created the virus to collapse the economy for financial gain. That's sort of getting for 20% of people surveyed that believed that that could be a reason behind COVID-19. I mean, it's completely crazy. Muslims are spreading the virus as an attack on Western values. I mean, yeah, that is just under 20%. Then there are some more kind of benign conspiracy theories, like Boris Johnson's faked having coronavirus. But yeah, I think it goes to show that there is a not insignificant number of people prepared to believe in conspiracy theories. So I'll leave it there. That's the end of my talk. I hope it's been useful and interesting. I'll stop presenting now. But yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Paul, for a really insightful presentation. We do have a bit of time for questions, and I'll stop the recording now.